Hi, I'm Geoff Rhodes, a toxicologist with the Water Resources Division here at the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. And I wanted to give a quick update on the Muskegon River watershed surface water PFAS investigation that we carried out in 2022. I wanted to start with a quick introduction to PFAS as a chemical class. PFAS contain carbon and fluorine bonds, making them particularly resistant to degradation. These compounds are also commonly used in consumer and industrial products. And these two factors have contributed to their widespread detection in the environment. Additionally, these compounds can pose a human health risk and be accumulative in organisms. The surface water assessment section of Michigan's Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy conducts monitoring for PFAS in surface waters to identify sources of PFAS and prioritize areas for additional investigation. Additional investigations include source identification and differentiation, trend monitoring, and public health monitoring. We conduct a variety of different sampling procedures. We'll do surface water sampling like we conducted in the Muskegon. We'll also take fish samples for fish tissue analysis. Additionally, we'll do passive sampler studies where we deploy passive samplers within a water body to get a better long-term picture on trends. This is just our current list of PFAS analytes that we look at. Right now, there are 31 that we analyze for in surface water. And just to have these available for anyone who's curious, I wanted to throw this up. So here are the surface water sampling locations for surface water samples that we collected from the Muskegon River watershed. Surface water samples were collected from 62 locations across the watershed in 2022. The sites were selected to target major rivers and confluences, industrialized areas, and areas with increased population density. Additionally, we had some foam reports come in that we went and collected surface water samples in response to, and we also targeted popular fishing locations. Currently, we have water quality values for PFOS, PFOA, and PFBS. Additional water quality value development is prioritized based on the occurrence of PFAS analytes within surface water and fish tissues, the availability of mammalian toxicity research, and the availability of bioaccumulation data. So these are our current water quality values. The most applicable for this situation would be the human non-cancer value, HNV, non-drinking. That's for waters that don't serve as a drinking water source. And so for PFOS, that is 12 parts per trillion. For PFOA, that is 170 parts per trillion. And for PFBS, that is 670,000 parts per trillion. We had 4 exceedances of our water quality values for PFOS only in the Muskegon River watershed. And these were observed in the Muskegon area. There were no other exceedances of our PFAS water quality values throughout the watershed. And so just to touch on the Muskegon area where we did observe exceedances, that would be, as I'm sure you're all familiar, this lower left-hand corner of the figure here. In addition to PFOS, we detected 10 other PFAS compounds within our surface water samples in this area. And those are shown on the left-hand column. And so exceedances for our water quality values of 12 nanograms per liter were observed in Ruddyman Creek, would be right here. Ryerson Creek right here, 4 Mile Creek, and an unnamed tributary to Muskegon Creek over here. And then we saw elevated concentrations of PFOS, but not exceeding our water quality value in Spring Creek Lake, which is right here, Mosquito Creek right here, and a pond near the north branch of the Muskegon River, and then Bear Lake. I wanted to focus in on the Mosquito Creek area. These are radar plots for surface water concentrations of PFAS. The axes aren't particularly important. What we're looking at here is the general shape of the radar plots. These radar plots can be used as an initial investigation tool for source tracking. When interpreting these radar plots, because all axes of the plots are identical, the general shape of the plot can be used to compare the composition of PFAS in each water samples. So as you can see, the radar plot for Mosquito Creek, shown here, was similar to the unnamed tributary radar plot shown here, which indicates that these two surface water bodies may share a similar source. Interestingly, the radar plot for Spring Creek Lake has a shape reminiscent to both of those radar plots, which could suggest that surface water body is influenced by the same source. And there may be some kind of hydraulic connection between the locations, such as groundwater flow. No significant amounts of PFAS were observed in the Muskegon River sample collected downstream of Mosquito Creek here. Now I wanted to speak on the Ruddiman Creek area near Muskegon Heights. Looking at these two radar plots, they have very similar shapes. And this suggests there is a distinct and significant source upstream of both locations. And this is the 4 Mile Creek area and the Ryerson Creek area. The composition of PFAS within the 4 Mile Creek sample, shown here, and the Ryerson Creek sample, shown here, are similar, which can once again indicate a common source or similar origins of contamination. The downstream 4 Mile Creek sample that we collected has a very dissimilar profile, PFAS compositional profile, in comparison to the upstream sample, which may be due to the effects of dilution. Other radar plots from this area, those collected from Bear Lake and Muskegon Lake, do not indicate similar compositions, and there's no characteristics of a significant source that may be contributing to these upstream. To summarize, concentrations of PFAS exceeded our water quality value of 12 nanograms per liter at 4 locations. An additional 5 locations had elevated concentrations of PFOS. Detections of PFECHS and PFHXSA were atypical, as these analytes are not commonly identified in Michigan surface water samples. And these analytes could be used for future source identification and source differentiation work in the watershed. And so that surface water data has been shared with the relevant state of Michigan staff to facilitate these follow-up investigations, specifically source identification and differentiation. And I wanted to take a brief pause for any questions that anyone may have here before I speak on sampling within the rest of the watershed.
No questions. I see a hand up, a couple hands.
Yeah. Sure. Mary Cooper.
Yeah, so my question is about if you live in one of these areas that's near where now we know has elevated levels, is there some way that the state is contacting people to let them know that they're potentially exposed to something like this?
For surface water concentrations of PFAS, we don't have a notification system in place as far as I'm aware. We do have something for residential wells or, municipal wells. Specifically for these elevated concentrations, these areas have or will likely be listed or are listed in our Eat Safe Fish guidelines. And so there would be which Brandon Reid will speak on later. There will be information presented so that fish consumption advisories can be presented to the public so that consumption of fish can be limited to what would be considered a safe amount. But there's, as far as I'm aware, there's no posting that would go in effect at these water bodies. If you're speaking on like a beach posting or something similar.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Irma?
Yes, thank you. I'm not sure this might not be appropriate question, but I'm curious about PFAS and sediment. And is part of your testing, do you test the sediment as well as surface water? I'm thinking it's just, you're just doing surface water, but what can you tell me about PFAS and sediment, or where can I look for more information?
Yeah, so the surface water assessment section does actually have a sediment monitoring program that's run by Lee Schoon and Sam Nofke here in the surface water assessment section. I handle just the surface water itself as opposed to the sediment, but we do have sediment collections in various locations throughout the state, looking at PFAS concentrations. PFAS in general can sorb to sediments. The degree to which various PFAS will sorb to the sediments is based upon physiochemical properties of the PFAS themselves, as well as sediment specific properties such as sediment composition in terms of mineral, organic content, etc. And so that is something that we do monitor. And in addition to that, we have a list where we've seen exceedances in surface water concentrations of various PFAS analytes, or elevated concentrations in fish tissues, and will require additional sediment sampling when there are dredging projects in the area. So if you were interested in more sediment sampling questions, I can probably get with you or Fallon to send you Sam and Lee's contact information. I also might be able to find a sediment monitoring program link within our surface water assessment section, just general EGLE web page that I could send out to you.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you.
No problem.
And yeah, Geoff, you can send that right to me and I can send it to Irma. That works. And then I saw in the chat, there was questions about groundwater and testing that as well.
Yeah, groundwater is tested by the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the emerging pollutants section. That's not really my area of expertise. There are groundwater samples collected for PFAS analysis, especially near, and as well as MPART. They will also, in general, monitor groundwater, especially near known sites of PFAS contamination. Hopefully
Okay,
that was, hopefully that was enough information, Kathy.
And then did you test surface waters at Wolf Lake?
Lake, let me pull up and check. Yes, we did test surface waters at Wolf Lake. And looking at the results quickly, there was nothing detected outside of typical Michigan background. There are various PFAS analytes that are seen in surface waters across the state. And looking at the Wolf Lake results specifically, those analytes were ones that were present. They were present at concentrations that would be expected for the population density surrounding this area.
I don't see anything else in the chat or any more hands raised. So
Sweet. All right. So I will move on. So I did want to go over the rest of the PFAS detections very briefly within the Muskegon River watershed. And so this picture here shows where we detected at least one PFAS analyte above the reporting limit. And so that was at 42 locations across the watershed. And just to give you guys some context, we detect at least one PFAS in our surface water samples 94% of the time. And these locations here, specifically the Cadillac area, the Houghton Lake area, and then this very large portion of the Muskegon River watershed here in the middle. These PFAS detections were at concentrations that, as I mentioned, are commonly observed across the state. There weren't distinct enough to indicate a specific or significant source. The analytes detected are present in more than 50% of the samples that we've collected from across the surface waters of the state of Michigan. There are some samples that we will be following up with for additional source identification and differentiation work, but there wasn't any exceedances or an indication of significant PFAS contamination within these surface water bodies. And that was my last slide related to our surface water sampling. If there are any further questions, I'd be happy to answer them now.
Oh, there's one more in the chat. Is there any indication of the source of the contamination?
The amount of surface water samples that we collected was more of a screening type initial investigation. So to do a really clear job for source identification and differentiation, we'd have to go through and follow up on specific areas where we saw elevated concentrations of various PFAS. And so that work has been passed off to other staff within the state of Michigan. And there isn't enough information from this limited data set to really pinpoint or identify specific sources. Or you can only look at general trends between samples that were collected at that point in time. But there are plans to go through and further differentiate and identify sources, especially at the areas where we saw exceedances of our PFAS criteria.
Not exactly a question, but I understand that the SAPI site is not part of the study. Oh, it is. Do you have any helpful information you can share about the site that has identified PFAS?
Off the top of my head, sorry, I'm not great at off the top of my head. I don't have anything that I could say with confidence about the SAPI site, but I can look into it and get back to Fallon if that would be helpful for you.
Yeah, that would work for me.
And then it looks like we had one about the new PFAS site on Whitehall Road. And so we, as part of that investigation and identifying that area as PFAS impacted, I did look at surface water samples that we've collected in the area, and there wasn't anything that we've collected that was indicative of being impacted by that Whitehall Road site. Although it is now on our list of areas to conduct future monitoring on, specifically collecting samples on surface water bodies closer to the area of contamination.
All right.
If that's the last question, I can turn it over to Brandon Reid to speak on our Eat Safe Fish program.
It sounds good.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Yep. Thank you, Geoff.
Let's see. I will stop sharing.
Right, I will share my screen as well. All right, is that showing up okay?
Yes.
All right, perfect. So hi everyone again. My name is Brandon Reid. I'm the Eat Safe Fish Program Manager at the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. I want to talk about the Eat Safe Fish program a bit. I'm going to try my best to get all the information out without taking up too much time, because I do want to leave a good bit of time for questions in case folks have those. So I will dig right into that. To start with an overview, I will talk a bit about our program history for the Eat Safe Fish program. Then I'll move into the guideline process, kind of talk about how we go from getting our data from our partners at EGLE all the way into how we set guidelines and put them in our Eat Safe Fish guide, which is kind of like a compendium collection of all of the Eat Safe or all the fish consumption guidelines that we issue and put out in the public. And then lastly, I'll finish up with specific Eat Safe Fish guidelines for some water bodies in the Muskegon Lake watershed. So to start up with some history of our program, it's been around since as early as 1970, when the first consumption advisory for mercury was issued. This was due to its known presence in Michigan and the known risk due to minimum disease. Since then, we've added several different contaminants that we will analyze contaminant data for in fish and issue consumption guidelines. That includes PCBs and DDT, dioxins, a couple different pesticides, dieldrin, chlordane, and toxaphene, selenium, particularly for MLWP, and then the most recent one in 2012, we started issuing guidelines for PFAS, or perfluorooctane sulfonate. This is one member of the PFAS family, and the reason that we specifically assign our Eat Safe Fish guidelines on PFOS and not the total amount of PFAS or a different PFAS chemical is because we know that PFOS is a chemical that particularly bioaccumulates in fish. And generally, as we've looked at fish, we found that that's the chemical that shows up the most often, it shows up most commonly. And so we decided to base our PFAS consumption guidelines on the level of that specific PFAS chemical, PFOS. So to start with, to move on to the Eat Safe Fish guideline process, I'm going to talk a bit about the sampling and analysis that goes into our data, then talk a bit about how we evaluate that data that we get, and then finally how we issue our guidelines. So that sampling and analysis phase starts with fish collection, which is completed primarily by our partners at EGLE, but also some other agencies as well that help out. EGLE will process those fish and then send the processed samples over to our MDHHS lab for analysis. So that fish sample collection, our fish consumption advisories that we issue are based on chemical levels in the edible portions of fish for Michigan water bodies. So to kind of break that down a bit, we look at particularly the edible portions of fish, because that's the part of the fish that people are most likely to eat. And so we know that that is going to be the most representative of what people would be exposed to from eating a meal of fish. For most fish, the edible portion is the fillet, but this is not always the case. For example, for rainbow smelt, it's common to eat those fish headless and gutted. So that's how EGLE prepares those samples and tests those for chemicals. Again, those fish are primarily collected by EGLE's Fish Contaminant Monitoring Program, or FCMP. The manager of that program is Brandon Armstrong, and my understanding is that he talked to this group just recently, as he's the one who reached out to me about talking here. So our two programs, the Eat Safe Fish program and the Fish Contaminant Monitoring Program, are very closely linked. We spend a lot of time together planning which water bodies to be sampled and exchanging data and talking about what data we've collected. So we've got a really good relationship between our two programs and our two departments as a whole. But we also get help from the DNR Fisheries Division, as well as the United States Geological Survey, as well as community partners and tribal governments that also collect samples for us. During the sample processing, the FCMP biologists collect information like length and weight for each fish that is collected. The edible portions are then sent to our MDHHS laboratory. And then those edible portions are individually blended into kind of like a paste-like substance that can be analyzed for contaminant concentrations. The MDHHS Analytical Chemistry Lab, which is the part of our laboratory that does our fish sample analysis, can quantify concentrations of the following contaminants from the individual sample. And I kind of went over these a bit before when I talked about our history of advisories. But again, those chemicals are mercury, PCBs, and organochlorine pesticides, total dioxins, furans, and coplanar PCBs, toxaphene, selenium, and PFAS, including PFOS. Currently, all samples that reach the lab are tested for mercury, all fish samples that reach the lab are tested for mercury and PFAS. But there are additional chemical analyses that are selected that are based on the location of the water body where the fish are collected and the actual fish species that are being tested. This is because some of these contaminants are regional and have only been found in certain parts of the state. For example, selenium is one that's particularly common in the UP. So fish from the UP are tested for selenium. Similarly, fish from Lake Huron and Saginaw Bay are usually tested for PCBs and dioxins due to historical contamination in those water bodies. So the next step in this guideline process is data evaluation. During this step, Eat Safe Fish scientists will review the fish contaminant data that's been sent to us by the lab and determine if a consumption guideline is warranted. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it gets pretty technical. I'm of course happy to send information to anybody who's interested after the fact, and we have all of our information online. But just to give a brief background on how that process works, when we get that data from the lab, we get concentrations of chemicals in the edible portions. We compare those concentrations to what we call fish consumption screening values, or FCSVs. These are what are called health-based screening values. They're based on toxicity values, like those established by the EPA and the ATSDR. And these toxicity values protect against the most sensitive toxicity endpoint. So in other words, exposure below these concentrations is expected to be without an appreciable risk of any harmful health effects. The calculation of these values also includes uncertainty factors to be health protective and conservative. So the purpose, and the reason I bring this up is to say that when we set our fish consumption guidelines, they're intended to be protective against the most sensitive possible effect that you could have from exposure to the chemicals in question. And you can find more information on our FCSVs in Appendix A of the Michigan Fish Consumption Advisory Program guidance document, which is available on the Eat Safe Fish website, michigan.gov/eatsafefish. I'm happy to send around these slides afterwards, and that is a hot link there. So you can just click that link there and it'll take you to that page on our website. So once we get the data from the lab, it comes to us in, once EGLE gets the data from the lab, they compile that into what we call recommendation sheets. It includes all of the data, kind of like a data summary from the lab about all of the different chemical analyses that have been conducted for a specific fish species from a specific water body. So the example that I put up here is for lake trout in Lake Superior. So it includes all the information on all the different data sets, all the different samples that have been collected for lake trout from Lake Superior. And it summarizes that all in one document that we use to kind of guide our advisories, our fish consumption advisories. In general, the advisory that we put out is based on the most health protective meal category. So it might be a little hard to see, but looks like the lake trout here were sampled for mercury, PCBs, DDT, chlordane, toxaphene. Okay, so it got like kind of like pretty much the whole battery of tests. And the lowest meal category there is a 0.5. for PCBs. So that is because it's the lowest meal category, it's the most restrictive, the most health protective, and that's what we set our guidelines on, is that lowest or most health protective meal category. But that's not always the case. It's not always the situation that our guidelines are directly based on what the data says. Sometimes we have information about an area where we know that there's an active source. And even if the data is showing that the fish may be looking pretty clean to eat, we may want to be more health protective because we know that there's an ongoing source contributing. So it's likely that there are more fish that have higher levels of contaminants than the ones that we measured. There are also considerations about the data set, and if we have an older data set, if those numbers are still going to be reliable, or if we think that they may have decreased over time. And if we have information about other species in the same water body where we're maybe seeing a higher levels in some species, but not another one, and if we expect that they should be the same, then we may bump up or restrict a advisory a little bit more to be health protective. But we'll consider all these factors, and overall, our goal is to be health protective with our guidelines, and what we release is in furtherance of that mission of being health protective. So the last step in our process is actually issuing the guidelines. This includes our efforts to prepare the Eat Safe Fish Guide, which I talked about before, is kind of like a summary of all of the guidelines that we have for water bodies in Michigan, as well as our statewide Safe Fish Guidelines, which apply to water bodies in Michigan that do not have sampling, where we don't have specific information about fish in that water body. So the Eat Safe Fish Guide contains, again, all the water body specific guidelines we've issued. There are 5 regional guides, the UP, as well as 4 different guides for the Lower Peninsula, for the 4 directional quadrants. So the guidelines for the Muskegon area would be in the Southwest Regional Guide, as Muskegon is located in the Southwest Lower Peninsula. The Eat Safe Fish program will regularly update the Eat Safe Fish Guide based on new data that's been collected since the previous update. But in addition to these guidelines, it contains helpful information for anglers, like how our guidelines are developed, how to identify common fish in Michigan, and how to properly clean and cook a fish to remove the most contaminants from the meal. The Eat Safe Fish Guide is organized by county, water body, and species. Each county has a map showing water bodies with their specific guidelines, and it includes other information like the chemical that actually drives that guideline. And I kind of mentioned before what guideline is of the most concern for health, along with the size of the fish, if it's applicable to the guideline, and the actual consumption guideline itself. Our guidelines are in Michigan servings per month, or my servings per month. And this is a serving size that differs based on body weight, since we know that body weight impacts how much chemicals in fish affect the individual. So a my serving is roughly 8 ounces for an adult, lower for a child, around 2 to 4 ounces. But there's information in the Eat Safe Fish Guide to calculate your own specific my serving. So to go over and look at the advisories for Bear Lake over there, and I've got this later in the slide deck too, but just to kind of explain what these mean. So the first table there in Muskegon County is for Bear Lake, and it's that first column there shows the type of fish, or the fish species. The next column shows the chemical of concern, or what we would call the driving contaminant that caused the guideline that you see to the right. The next column there is the size of the fish, if it applies to the guideline, and then lastly, the actual guideline itself. So that first line for carp, the guideline for carp in Bear Lake is a do not eat, which means that we would say do not eat any meals of carp. Even one meal could raise your risk of a harmful health effect. That guideline is based on PCBs, and that applies to carp of any size. If you look down to walleye, you'll see that those recommendations for walleye are different based on the size of the fish. For fish under 18 inches, it's 4 MI servings per month based on mercury. And for larger walleye over 22 inches, it has a limited guideline, which is kind of a special guideline that we have basically for any sensitive populations. And we have a description of that in the guide as well. To not have any servings, so to treat it as a do not eat. And if you are not someone who's sensitive to chemicals, then we would say to still limit to around 1 to 2 meals of that per year. And let's see. Okay, the next slide, just to kind of dive more into what a guideline means when we say if we say that something has a guideline of 1 meal per month or 2 meals per month. So consuming more fish than what we have established as the Eat Safe Fish guideline does not mean that you will suffer a harmful health effect. If the guideline is 2 meals per month and you are eating 3 meals per month, it does not mean that you will have some harmful health effect. If to say the guideline is 8 servings per month, consuming up to 8 servings per month is not going to be expected to raise your risk of any harmful health effects. But consuming more than that guideline may raise your risk of some harmful health effects. So again, our guidelines are based on risk. They're not based on an effect happening or not happening, but what may increase your risk or your chances of that harmful health effect happening to you. Our goal in these guidelines is to minimize risk, since we know that everyone responds to chemicals differently. So someone may never even know that these are a thing. They may eat fish, much more frequently than our guidelines, and they may never have a harmful health effect. But another person may eat the same amount, and they may end up developing some kind of health effect because of that. But again, our goal is to minimize risk, since everyone responds to chemicals differently. I've got a couple slides here about special guidelines and advisories. I think I'll go ahead and skip those just to save a little bit on time, because I do want to get to the specific guidelines for the Muskegon Lake area. And I did already talk about the limited guideline. A description, I do have these written out. So the populations that we say should avoid fish with the limited guideline, that includes people who may have children in the next several years, are currently pregnant or are breastfeeding, people with pre-existing health conditions like cancer or heart disease, and children under age 15. All others should still limit their consumption of limited fish to 1 or 2 meals per year. And lastly, just to quickly talk about our statewide safe fish guidelines. These apply to fish that do not have water body specific guidelines. So if you don't see a listing for your fish in the Eat Safe Fish guide, then we would say to defer to these statewide guidelines. Most of these are based on mercury, because we know that mercury is kind of ubiquitous in fish. There's a lot of mercury. This is a global contaminant in fish. You can kind of just expect that fish are going to have a little bit of mercury in them, just based on our understanding of global contamination for mercury. Some of these, though, for carp and catfish are based on PCBs. So I have a table listed here, and I just as an example, if you're fishing the water body above, and you would follow the listed guidelines for carp and suckers, as we have data on carp and suckers from this water body, but we would recommend following the statewide guidelines or the statewide safe fish guidelines for all other species caught from that water body. So for example, if you catch a bass or bluegill or walleye from that water body, we would recommend following our statewide safe fish guidelines. And those are also in our Eat Safe Fish guides. They're also able to be found on our Eat Safe Fish website. I went ahead and included a link on that page as well. That'll take you to those. But that includes a lot of fish, not every fish that you can catch in Michigan, but I think 16 different species we have statewide safe fish guidelines for. So between that and what we have for water body specific guidelines, we have a lot of advice and guidance available for people who are trying to find and eat safer fish. So I'll go ahead and stop there. I've shared a lot. I want to make sure I stop there in case anyone has any questions about the program as a whole or anything I've talked about so far before I move into the specific guidelines that we have for the Muskegon Lake area.
This is Leah. I have a quick question. If you're familiar with what you find to be the most effective outreach method for the Eat Safe Fish program. I think that our outreach efforts have a similar audience of folks who would, engage directly with the water. And so I'm just curious if you find any particular avenue to be the most effective.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And it's unfortunate. I actually had a couple slides about our outreach, which are, I think I actually still have them in here. So I'll move over and see if I do. I do. Okay. So I would say in general, what we've found is that in-person conversations are usually the best way to reach people about this kind of information. One of the struggles that we have is we want to make sure that our information is accurate and scientifically defensible, but at the same time, that makes it a little hard to just kind of explain. They're more complicated, and it's we feel it's easier to kind of get the information across with in-person conversations. That speaks to kind of one of our flagship outreach techniques, which is establishing river walker programs. These are seasonal employees who work to spread our information and messaging through in-person conversations with anglers. We've had 4 programs established so far. One's in the Saginaw Bay area, the Detroit River, the Huron River watershed, and the Kalamazoo River watershed. Across those 4 programs, they talk to thousands of anglers each year about safe fish consumption. And we found that they're not only good ways to share information, but also good ways to build trust. And that's another good kind of prerequisite to getting buy-in from people who've never heard about this before and never considered the health risks of eating fish. So yeah, I would say in general, in-person conversations are better, but we always try to do a multi-pronged approach where, in person, as well as, having all of our information available online, doing interviews with, news media, just trying to get the word out there that, these are concerns. But yeah, it's a hard question. It's definitely a hard question.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I think Dusty raised his hand. Dusty, do you have a question still?
Thanks, Fallon, and thank you, Brandon and Geoff, both great presentations. You had mentioned that Brandon was on with us on our small technical committee meeting. We talked a little bit about some of the fish that had been sampled for PFAS in Muskegon Lake and some in Bear Lake, that there were some detected concentrations of PFAS in the fish. And I just wanted to bring that up on this meeting, as it, as there are PFAS in the water, we would expect that question. Well, what about the fish? And my understanding from Brandon's discussion was that while there are some PFAS detections in the fish, that those would not trigger a more conservative eat safe fish guidance than what is already in place based on another compound, PCBs. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that real quick, Brandon.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to talk about that. So Brandon Armstrong, who talked with you at the technical meeting, is completely correct. So the last sampling that was done for Muskegon Lake and Bear Lake, which we consider together since they're connected water bodies, the last sampling they did was, I think, just in this last year in 2022. They're still waiting on, I think it's the PCB data for those fish. So So we at MDHHS haven't seen that yet since all the data hasn't been in yet. But the last time they were collected before that looks like was 2017 for rock bass and largemouth and smallmouth bass. And looks like the PFAS levels in those fish were pretty low. In one of them, it would correspond to our lowest meal category of 16 meals per month. And in the other, looks like a little bit higher on the largemouth and smallmouth bass would correspond to a meal category of 8 meals per month for PFAS. But in both situations, in both species, there's another chemical that was of greater concern for health. For the largemouth and smallmouth bass, it was PCBs, which correspond to 6 meals per year of largemouth or smallmouth bass from Muskegon or Bear Lake. And for the rock bass, it was mercury at 4 my servings per month. So yes, in both situations, it wasn't PFAS that was driving our advice, because there are other contaminants in fish that we're also concerned about. Most commonly mercury, but also in areas with historical PCB contamination, that's also a common driver for our fish consumption guidelines.
Right. Brandon, are you still going to outline the specifics on Muskegon Lake?
Yeah, if there's time to, I am 100% happy to. So I will move into that right now. So I have the guidelines here for Muskegon Lake and Bear Lake, Black Creek and Mona Lake, Muskegon River, Runnyman Creek Lagoon, and White Lake. I'll keep it to the Muskegon Lake and Bear Lake and Muskegon River and the Runnyman Creek Lagoon. But if there are folks that want to see Black Creek or Mona Lake or White Lake, please feel free to speak up, and I can absolutely go through those too. So I'll start with Muskegon Lake and Bear Lake. The majority of these are based on PCBs. There are a couple that are also based on mercury. So carp are at our do not eat advisory. We wouldn't recommend not even serving of carp from Muskegon Lake or Bear Lake. Largemouth and smallmouth bass have the same guideline of 6 meals per year, which is pretty restrictive, both based on PCBs as well. As I mentioned, our rock bass are at 4 servings per month, which is comparatively a little bit cleaner compared to the other fish, based on mercury. Northern pike are at 2 my servings per year, which is pretty standard for northern pike. And our walleye, looks like our walleye really depend on the size of the fish. So smaller walleye under 18 inches, 4 servings per month, relatively clean for the water body. But as you get to larger fish, 18 to 22 inches or over 22 inches, that starts to decrease fast, because the data we have for walleye has shown that they tend to take up more chemicals as they get larger in size. That's pretty common for larger upper trophic levels species like walleye and northern pike. As they get bigger, they tend to have more chemicals. And the data that we have for walleye showed that in Muskegon Lake and Bear Lake. And then based on our understanding of the historical contamination of PCBs in this area, we issued a blanket all other species guideline limiting to 6 meals per year. And that was a decision that we made knowing that that historical contamination is there, and in the absence of other data that show otherwise. So again, those 6 species up there we've collected data from, and that my servings per month is based on the data we've collected. And then for all other species that you might catch from Muskegon Lake and Bear Lake, we would we would recommend limiting to 6 meals per year for those fish. For the Muskegon River, downstream of the Croton Dam in Newaygo County, and going up to where the river flows into Muskegon Lake. There are just two recommendations here for suckers based on mercury. This includes white suckers and red horse suckers. The chemical of concern there is mercury, and the recommendation is 2 servings per month. And then with walleye, concern is again PCBs, and the recommendation there is 6 per year for walleye from Muskegon River.
Brandon, what's the superscript? Yeah, there 2X.
Yeah, yep, happy to talk about that. So that is an indication that if the fish is properly cleaned and cooked in a way that removes the fat and the skin from the fish, then that my servings category can be doubled. Because the reasoning for that is that the chemical of concern for that fish, PCBs, is one that stores in the fat and skin of the fish. So removing as much of that as you can before eating it, before cooking it and eating it, will really help to minimize the amount that ends up on your plate and ends up in your body. So following the, excuse me, what are the two? Cooking and cleaning. So cleaning, meaning removing all fat and skin from the fish before cooking, and then cooking in a way that the additional fat would melt and drip away from the fish. So not in a pan, but rather on a rack, in a way that once the fat melts, it'll drip away from the fish, and further minimize the amount of the chemicals that store up in fat.
Brandon, this may be a silly question, but if you went back a slide and you've got a number of fish that's there with the number of my servings per month that you've listed, how do these get treated? If I say I catch northern pike and I've got, my 2 meals per month, and hey, I've got rock bass and I've got 4, is this a cumulative thing that, I'm sure the chemicals are, but is your chart interpreted that you stick to one species, or are you able to dab a little from each? And if so, how does that affect the meal count?
Yeah, no, that's not a silly question at all. Actually, a very, very good question. And I would say that it is the accumulative approach, or the cumulative approach. So say that you are someone who eats rock bass regularly and you're eating 4 servings per month, just about every month. For another species, let's say, those smaller sized walleye, if you catch one of those that's based on mercury, having, that walleye in addition to, let's say, like the fill that you're getting from the rock bass, that would push you over into the point where you would be having a greater risk for mercury from those fish.
Okay, so you're really looking at, if you see rock bass is at a total of 4, and like say smaller walleyes at 4, the combination of the different varieties or species, should limit it to 4.
Yeah. Yep,
Okay.
that's true. And what I would add to that too is that while we issue our recommendations and usually per month, what our calculations really are based on are a yearly exposure to fish. So it really breaks down to, if you've got 2 per month, it really is 24 servings per year. So say you have a couple servings of walleye 1 month. Let's say you catch walleye and you're having let's say you have 6 meals that month, but you're not having more until another month, a couple months later, and then you're not eating walleye again for the rest of the year. You only have 2 months out of the year, so you're only having, let's say, 12, maybe 18 servings per year of walleye. You're still under that 24, and you're still under that 24 per year. Excuse me, for walleye, actually, 4 times 12 is 48. So actually, you've got 48 servings of walleye, so you're probably fine. But that's another consideration too. So if you're not eating regularly every month, you're not freezing fish and eating over the winter, that's another consideration too. So we like to include that as a way to kind of balance that. While yes, it is cumulative, it is based on over a year. So if you're averaging out over a year, that's another thing to take into consideration too. That's a lot of time where your body can process those chemicals and detoxify and get rid of them, so that you can eat more fish and still be safe.
I see a couple questions down in the notes here. I don't know if you see those or you want me to read them.
I'm gonna try to pull them up, but if you could start with one, that'd be great.
Jamie's asking for a community like Muskegon, where fishing is not only a sport, but we have sustenance fishermen. This information is concerning, and so I think she's just voicing a concern there. I don't know if you need to address that.
No, I mean, yeah, it is, and that's a lot of why we put our guidelines out, is for communities that do eat fish as sustenance. Fish eat fish as more than just for recreation. That's a lot of why we have these out here. For most people, or for people who eat only a couple servings per year, you're probably safe unless you're eating a do not eat fish. But people who are eating every month, every week, it certainly adds up. So that's a lot of what we're trying to do in outreach recently, is trying to reach some of those more sustenance populations that do eat more fish than the average person.
And I think your walker programs that you indicated you've used in 4 other locations, that's actually probably the best way to reach the sustenance fish crowd, because they're usually on the bridges, the overpasses of the rivers and creeks, and near shore where they can be reached, which kind of lines up. Kathy posed a question in the chat. Will the Eat Safe Fish program update signage for fishing access locations as part of the MPART public notification process?
That's a good question. I'm wondering about with these, do you have any more information about what specifically those signs are stating? Because I want to make sure, because we have signs that we will create an issue for example, water bodies that have a do not eat advisory for the whole water body. We will issue a sign that just says, do not eat fish from this water body. We are aware of contamination, and we would recommend not eating any fish. But there are also different signs, I think, that are issued by the DNR for certain water bodies that talk about different regulations for fish in those water bodies. So I need a little more information about kind of which signs specifically. Yeah.
So my question was related to the first time when the Eat Safe Fish program was developed. I believe there was also signage that looked a lot like the pamphlets, the blue color and pictures and all that, to further explain right at the location. So we were part of the focus groups that helped develop those initial messages. And then we got some of the signs and put them at different locations where we know people access the fish to shore, anglers who shore fish. And so those were really good signs. I don't know if they need to be reproduced as is, or if possibly updated with new information. But I thought those were pretty effective, along with the brochures and the events. And I know Michigan Department of Community Health, or Health and Human Services, attended a lot of our festivals here and passed out information over the years. And that was great. But I think those signs are really important, because that's where people go to fish from shore. And you have children, subsistence fishermen, and just people who like to fish and eat fish, kind of more regularly. I think a lot of times we don't know unless, we see that sign right at the location where we fish.
Yeah, absolutely. And can I ask, do you know if those signs were created through the AOC? Do you know if they were related to the AOC funding? I know we have a lot of those signs out for different AOCs.
Well, we did use them in the AOC. We used them here, but they were the Eat Safe Fish program. So, they were, the same color, the logos, the, blue, all of that. So I don't know where the funding originally came from. It probably was Great Lakes Restoration Initiative or something, Great Lakes funding. But I think it was Michelle who was involved in that. And I don't think she works there anymore, but I think I met you before, Brandon, years ago.
Okay.
Maybe,
Okay.
but anyway, I think the signs are good. If there's a way to get signs and get funding for signs, and if you want any local input, I think we'd be happy to sit down, some of us, and give input to you or whomever on what the effective messages might be for Muskegon Lake, Bear Lake,
Yeah,
Rowan Pond.
yeah, absolutely. And I will say that we are working to develop a sign that's a more general kind of eat safe fish sign. Right now we have, our do not eat signs. We had in the past more specific signs. I know we had ones for Detroit River that were specific to information for Detroit River. We had ones for Muskegon. I think we had other ones, the Saginaw Bay area as well. I know we had specific signs, and I believe a lot of those signs came from, like you said, a funding source that's since expired. And that was before my time. I came in, I've been around with the program for about 2 years now. So that was well before I was involved. But we are working on getting a more general kind of sign developed and approved so that we can send that out, and it'll apply to whatever areas it's sent to. And we'll have more information about the Eat Safe Fish guidelines so that we can get that and get that out and not, have to have outdated signs that may be incorrect or may have outdated information on them. So once we kind of get those signs ready to go, I will probably be reaching back out to this group and kind of hearing about where and how many signs are wanted, where where those signs are, where maybe the old signs are located, just for our knowledge. But yeah, I would be happy to partner with you guys if you'd be interested in putting more signs up and getting those replaced.
Okay, I see that we do have a couple hands up. Dusty, I think you've had yours up for a little while. We're going to need to wrap this up and move. We still have a lot of agenda to go. Dusty, do you have something you want to ask?
I'll just put my hand down. I think we've discussed.
Okay.
this
Jane?
fair enough. Thank you.
Still on mute, Jane.
Yeah, I was trying to get it. I was wondering, it said bluegill and perch. There were not, it looked like there weren't any guidelines. So is that saying with any of those fish, people can eat all they want?
Are you talking about specifically on this table for Muskegon Lake and Bear Lake?
Right. We looked it up on our tablet. We also looked it up there, and there was a little box that said bluegill and fish and perch were not part of these listings.
Yep. So this is that's an example where we would point you to our or actually, excuse me, I'm sorry, for this water body where it says so I mentioned we've got all the different species that were tested for. On the very bottom, we've got that all other species, and that would include bluegill, sunfish, yellow perch, anything that's not listed up in the rest of that box. If it's not listed for this water body, since it has that all other species, we would say follow that guideline 6 per year with the 2x if you cook it and clean it correctly. That would apply to the bluegill and the perch. For, let's say, hypothetically, for a situation like, if I could move to the next slide, like the Muskegon River, if you're catching bluegill or perch from the Muskegon River, and you can see there are not any guidelines there, and there's no information about, all of the species follow this guideline, we would say to defer to our statewide guidelines. And those, I think for both of those, it's 8 meals per year based on mercury. And that's based on statewide averages of mercury levels in those fish that we found around the state.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
All right, Brandon, thank you. And Geoff, if you're still out there, thank you for your presentations. We really appreciate the updates on this.
Absolutely. Thank you all for having me. And if there are any follow-ups, feel free to reach out to me. I've got my email address that I've shared